Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Ever since Khabib Nurmagomedov retired in 2020 as the UFC lightweight champion and subsequently Charles Oliveira won the vacant lightweight title the following year and had his own lightweight title reign, there has been a lot of debate about who is the UFC lightweight GOAT. And when having this discussion, there's mainly only two names brought up. That's Khabib Nurmagomedov and Charles Oliveira. And I know some people occasionally bring up BJ Penn, but that's a rarity. And also, I feel like he's disqualified. If you're getting brutally KO'd in street fights, you're disqualified from the GOAT conversation. But I wanted to make this video because when having the GOAT discussion, specifically at lightweight, there's been a few common talking points that people keep regurgitating, discrediting Charles Oliveira. And recently, Khabib Nurmagomedov's manager, Ali Abdelaziz, tweeted out some of these same talking points over and over and over again to discredit Charles Oliveira in the GOAT conversation. And I completely disagree with these points. And we're going to take a look at the tweet in a little bit. I'm going to give my opinion and why I disagree with these talking points. But we're going to take a look at Khabib Nurmagomedov's resume. We're going to take a look at Charles Oliveira's resume. And we're also going to discuss Islam Makhachev's resume because he's the current UFC lightweight champion. I feel like he's forgot about in this discussion. And I'm going to give my opinion on who is the GOAT at lightweight currently and also how the future could change it, because this discussion kind of got reignited with Charles Oliveira's massive win over Beneil Dariush at UFC 289. And there's talk of Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev 2 for the lightweight title. Can Charles Oliveira become a two-time lightweight champion? That's kind of what's reignited this discussion. I'm going to give my opinion on who I believe is the GOAT and how I believe there is already an argument to make that Charles Oliveira is already the GOAT. And then on top of that, even if you consider Oliveira below Khabib Nurmagomedov in the GOAT conversation, I believe there is a path in the very near future that Charles Oliveira can easily pass Khabib Nurmagomedov, regardless of these common talking points that will always be true. And I wanted to discuss it in this video. Now, before I get into all that, I know this discussion is highly subjective. Everybody's going to have a different opinion on what they weigh in terms of the GOAT conversation. But before I give you my full opinion on this whole debate, comment down below, who do you believe is the current lightweight GOAT? As of today, who do you believe is the lightweight greatest of all time? Okay, if you look at Khabib Nurmagomedov, we're going to talk about his title reign real quick. He won the vacant UFC lightweight title against Al Iaquinta in 2018. Not a super impressive performance, but he did dominate the fight, went to decision, he wins the lightweight title. Then his first title defense is against Conor McGregor at UFC 229, one of the biggest fights of all time. I believe actually it is the highest selling pay-per-view in UFC history. Absolutely dominates Conor McGregor, smashes him, brutally finishes him via neck crank in the fourth round. Then he goes on a year later, roughly a year later, and he fights Dustin Poirier at UFC 242. And I know people say, oh, Poirier rocked him in the first round or whatever it may have been, or second round, I think. I don't even believe he got rocked, but also he pretty much dominated that fight, and he was able to finish Dustin Poirier in the third round via rear naked choke. Then his last fight was at UFC 254 in 2020. You have October of 2020 against Justin Gaethje. And he absolutely dominates Justin Gaethje, even though some of the judges gave the first round to Justin Gaethje. He dominates Justin Gaethje. He finishes him in the second round via triangle choke. And he retires in the cage. His coach, his father, passed away, and he said, I don't want to go on without him. And a lot of people thought, okay, maybe Dana White's going to talk him to coming back. He said he's not coming back. I believed his retirement from day one. I don't believe he's ever coming back. Well, what happened with the lightweight title after that? After Khabib relinquished that lightweight title, Dana White was trying to sway him back and trying to sway him back. And finally, I think it was January or February, I think it was late January of 2021, Dana White announced the main event of UFC 262 will be Charles Oliveira versus Michael Chandler for the vacant lightweight title. And what happens in that fight? Charles Oliveira almost gets finished in the first round, comes out in the second round, and brutally finishes Michael Chandler in the second round via TKO. Now, after he wins the UFC lightweight title, he then goes on that very same year to defend against Dustin Poirier. He faces some adversity in this fight as well, but then he gets a third round rear naked choke, similar to Khabib Nurmagomedov. Then his next title defense, which actually technically wasn't a title defense, was against Justin Gaethje at UFC 274. He goes out there against Justin Gaethje, faces some adversity in the first round, eventually drops Justin Gaethje and rear naked chokes him in the first round to defend his title, but he missed weight going into that fight by like 0.5, and they said the scale was off. So technically in this fight, he was stripped as the champion, and this wasn't counted as a title defense. I still consider this a title defense. Then after that, UFC 280, Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev for the vacant lightweight title. This was actually much more competitive than I remember when I went back and rewatched it to do my prediction for Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush. But Islam Makhachev did win every round. He won the majority of the fight. And then he hurts Charles Oliveira in the second round and then follows him to the ground and submits him via triangle choke. And Charles Oliveira, this is the official end of his lightweight title reign, in my opinion. And I know technically he didn't lose the belt because it was for the vacant belt, but he lost the belt to Islam Makhachev. Well, since then, UFC 289, he defeats Beneil Dariush. A lot of people were counting him out. He defeats Beneil Dariush, and now he's right back in title discussion because Beneil Dariush was supposed to be the next guy to fight Islam Makhachev. Well, now you look at the lightweight division, there's not really a next guy unless you're going to do the winner of Justin Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier for the lightweight title, but they're fighting in late July, and Islam's going to need an opponent in late October, so it really doesn't line up. So Charles Oliveira is probably getting the next lightweight title shot. It's probably going to be Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira 2 for the lightweight title. I cannot wait for that fight, but that's not what this video is about. So people look at those two reigns and they try to debate about who is the GOAT of the lightweight weight class. And what they consistently bring up, and I want to take a look at Ali Abdelaziz's tweets that he put out recently, or his tweet that put out recently. John Anik put out a tweet and said, poll question for his podcast. He said, who do you believe is the greatest lightweight in UFC history? No wrong answers. Question is open to interpretation. I'd argue no one is more accomplished than Charles Oliveira, but is he your lightweight GOAT? Question mark. Ali Abdelaziz quoted this tweet and says, Charles is an amazing fighter, but you can't be a GOAT if you have 9 losses and got stopped 8 times compared to a guy like Khabib who had never been knocked down, had a cut, or barely lost 1 round in his career. Love you, John. And this has been regurgitated over and over again over the past couple years when having that conversation about Charles Oliveira's losses. But I want to look at Charles Oliveira's resume in general in a more grand scheme, because if you look at Charles Oliveira's resume, he has 2 title defenses, in my opinion. I know technically that one doesn't count, but in my mind, again, this is a very subjective argument. He has 2 title defenses, okay? He's been in the UFC since 2010. He entered the UFC at age 20, okay? He has 33 fights in the UFC. He's 22-10-1 with 1 no contest. And he has the most finishes in UFC history. He has 20 finishes. And he has most submission wins in UFC history, 16 submissions. He's been finished 8 times, but he also went on an 11-fight win streak in his prime to win the title. And then eventually that streak ended when he lost to Islam Makhachev, okay? So there's all Charles Oliveira's kind of credentials for GOAT. Then you look at Khabib Nurmagomedov. He's been in the UFC since 2012, age 23. He's 13-0 in the UFC. He has 7 UFC finishes, 3 title defenses, and 3 finishes in title fights. And also, he's dominated in the UFC, and he's never been cut. And also, he's only lost 2 rounds on any judge's scorecards. But actually, I think that's up for debate because I don't think he lost the first round to Justin Gaethje, and I don't think he lost the 3rd round to Conor McGregor either. So, in my opinion, again, very subjective debate, I think you could say he never lost a round in the UFC. But what I think you have to look at, and a lot of people forget about, is that Charles Oliveira entered the UFC at 20 years old and started taking on really stiff competition at 20 years old. Meanwhile, Khabib Nurmagomedov, I know he's 29-0, okay? He's undefeated, 29-0. That's the big discussion. That's a big talking point. He's 29-0. I give him credit. Going undefeated is very difficult. But if you look at some of his early fights, I mean, we're talking about very, very low competition. We're talking about, guys, you go up to like his 9th fight, 4-2. His 10th fight, 13-9. His next fight, the guy was 0-2 at that point in time. Next fight, 1-1. Next fight, 5-2. Before he entered the UFC, he was 15-0. But he fought horrible competition. So in my opinion, you can already throw out essentially all 15 of those fights before Khabib entered the UFC. Because those 15 fights were against such low-level competition, it doesn't matter. He's 14-0 in the UFC, and in my opinion, even though I don't believe only UFC fighters are good fighters, he's essentially 14-0 against non-bums. Because the guys he fought outside the UFC were not very good competition. They were just padding his record. But let's take a look at Charles Oliveira's resume as well, because you can kind of pick it apart as well. You look at some of his early fights, and up until his UFC debut, he didn't fight the best competition. His 11th fight, he was 11-0, but he fought a guy who was 4-4. So realistically, you can subtract 11 fights from Charles Oliveira's resume, and you can also subtract all those early fights from Khabib Nurmagomedov. You can subtract 15 fights from Khabib Nurmagomedov. And now when you look at Charles Oliveira and you subtract those fights, those 11 fights, he's essentially 23-9 against non-bums, aka non-UFC level of competition. And again, not every fighter outside the UFC is a bum, but I'm just saying in this particular circumstance, both these guys fought a lot of lower level competition, padding their records outside the UFC. But one main difference is Charles Oliveira entered the UFC at a younger age and took on very stiff competition at a younger age, 3 years younger than Khabib Nurmagomedov. And you go back and you look at his early UFC career, lost to Jim Miller. Jim Miller is still good to this day. Back in 2010, he was even better in 2010. He lost to Donald Cerrone. Donald Cerrone, I understand now he's retired, now he's not good over the last few years, but back in 2010 or 2011 when he lost to him and he got finished by him, very good fighter, and this is very young Charles Oliveira. Then he lost to Cub Swanson. Keep in mind also, this is at featherweight. He lost to Cub Swanson at UFC 152 back in 2012. So long ago and at a different weight class. Lost to Frankie Edgar at UFC 162. We're talking about 2013. Lost to Max Holloway. Lost to Anthony Pettis. Lost to Ricardo Lamas. Lost to Paul Felder. That is his last loss before Islam Makhachev. Look at the level of competition that he fought. I mean, every single one of those losses, none of them are bad. Honestly, there's not a single loss on Charles Oliveira's resume that is bad. Now, that's not to say Khabib Nurmagomedov couldn't have beat those opponents at the same time. But I'm just saying those losses are not that bad of losses to have. All those guys at one point in time or another, and in this particular case, when Charles Oliveira fought him, most of them were elite fighters. So you have to kind of credit that as well, because Charles is very young. He comes in the UFC, he immediately starts taking on stiff competition. And then you also have to factor in his last loss before Islam Makhachev was 2017, 6 years ago. 6 years ago against Paul Felder. It was December 2017, so technically it's like 5.5 years ago. That was his last loss before the Islam Makhachev loss. And what I don't get is people bring up these losses to discredit Charles Oliveira's claim at GOAT status. I honestly believe these losses make his GOAT claim even stronger, because to come into the UFC at such a young age, face all this adversity, lose all these fights, get stopped in a lot of these fights, get stopped by Paul Felder, get stopped by Ricardo Lamas, stopped by Anthony Pettis, suffer an injury and get stopped by Max Holloway, and then to go on the run that he had to get that lightweight title was incredible. And when people bring up these losses to discredit him from the GOAT conversation, what I say is, I pose one question. Are you not able to get better? Are you not able to improve? If I whoop Charles Oliveira's ass on the playground at 10 years old, does that make him ineligible for the GOAT discussion? Because he came into the UFC very, very early, fought elite competition in his early 20s, improved, built fight after fight to improve his skill set, and then he went on an 11-fight run. And I know some of the names, in the winning streak aren't the greatest. Clay Guida, Clay Guida, okay, he's a decent fighter at the time. I wouldn't want to hang out with him and his boys. But nonetheless, he beats Clay Guida. He beats Christos Gigas. He beats Jim Miller. He beats Nick Lentz. He beats Jarrett Gordon. Then he really starts to get into that contender discussion. He beats Kevin Lee, finishes Kevin Lee. He absolutely dominates Tony Ferguson. At this point, Tony Ferguson wasn't a dead corpse yet. Then he finishes Michael Chandler to win the vacant belt, finishes Dustin Poirier to defend the belt, finishes Justin Gaethje to defend the belt, and then loses to Islam Makhachev, but since his comeback and beat Beneil Dariush. I think there's a very good discussion to have and a very good argument to make. The resume as a whole for Charles Oliveira, having this many fights in the UFC, being 23-9 in the UFC versus Khabib, who's 14-0 in the UFC, I think there's a discussion to be made that he is already the GOAT. But then when you look at Khabib Nurmagomedov, when he came into the UFC, he fought a guy whose name I cannot even pronounce, low-level competition, not the greatest competition, but we'll still count it as a decent win. Then he beats Gleison Tibau. Solid win. Some people thought he lost that fight. Then he beats Abel Trujillo. I think he set a record for takedowns. And Khabib Nurmagomedov, don't get me wrong, Khabib is one of my favorite fighters. Khabib was incredible. Khabib was dominant. But let's take a look at his resume and discuss the fight by fight. Because Khabib goes out there, beats Gleison Tibau, competitive fight. Some people think he lost. Beat Abel Trujillo. I'm just kind of going through these. Beat Thiago Tavares. Beat Pat Healy, which actually wasn't a bad win at the time. He beat Rafael Dos Anjos. I'll never forget that. They were on the prelims at the time, and people couldn't believe, the hardcore fans couldn't believe Khabib Nurmagomedov and Rafael Dos Anjos. They look so good. They're such interesting prospects. They look like they'll be future champions. They inevitably did end up becoming champions. But to go out there and dominate Rafael Dos Anjos at that point in time was a very credible win. Then he fought Daryl Horcher. I think he was supposed to fight Tony Ferguson originally. Tony pulled out. Then he dominated Michael Johnson, finished him, dominated Edson Barboza to a decision, and then he won the belt against Al Iaquinta, dominated him, won that fight. Not super impressive because he didn't get the finish against Al Iaquinta, but still a solid win. Then dominates Conor McGregor, finishes him, dominates Dustin Poirier, finishes him, and dominates Justin Gaethje, finishes him. And I think I'm not saying people are going to think because I'm defending Charles Oliveira's resume, I'm trying to discredit Khabib's resume. Khabib's resume in the UFC is a very good resume. I mean, to go out there and put on the performances he did against Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor, and Al Iaquinta were incredible. And I know a lot of people are sad we never got to see Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson. I'm not sad one day in my life because guess what? Khabib would have mauled Tony Ferguson badly. And I believe Khabib is one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen. But I do believe you have to take into account that 29-0 record is padded quite a bit. And if you just want to count his UFC resume, he's 14-0 in the UFC. He has some great wins. He has 3 title defenses. But I still believe you look at Charles Oliveira, you see the work he put in at such a young age. I think you can make a conversation. I think you can make a legitimate argument that Charles Oliveira could already be considered the GOAT. Now, in my personal opinion, when you compare Khabib and Charles, I do believe it's really hard to decide, honestly. But what I look at, and I know a lot of people say, oh, well, Khabib was dominant. Khabib was never cut. I feel like those are tiebreakers. If you win, you win. It doesn't matter how you won the Super Bowl. It just matters that you won the Super Bowl. I believe if the resumes are just so tight and it's so close to a tie, that's when you start breaking out and saying, oh, well, Khabib never got cut, and Khabib never lost a round, or he only lost 1 round, or only lost 2 rounds, whatever that argument may be. And I do understand that the conversation is very close. But what I look at, in my personal opinion, I see Khabib has 3 title defenses. I see Charles has 2 title defenses, okay? And they fought a lot of the same guys. They both finished Justin Gaethje and Dustin Poirier. And, Khabib has the win over Conor McGregor. Charles Oliveira has the win over Michael Chandler. So it's very comparable in terms of the title run. But in my opinion, even though I've sat here and defended Charles Oliveira, I believe Khabib Nurmagomedov is just 1 notch above on the GOAT list for me right now in comparison to Charles Oliveira. But if Charles Oliveira goes out there and wins the title again, if he goes out there and defeats Islam Makhachev, the debate is over. Charles Oliveira is the greatest UFC lightweight of all time. If he goes out there and becomes 2-time UFC lightweight champion, he is the greatest UFC lightweight of all time. And his body of work speaks for itself. I don't care about the losses, okay? It doesn't matter. The losses don't matter. They don't matter. They're so long ago. You can get better in the sport. If Michael Jordan's getting beat on the basketball court when he's 12 years old, that doesn't exclude him from the GOAT debate when he gets into the NBA and starts hitting his prime. That's not how it works, in my opinion. So I do believe, you look at Charles Oliveira's strength of schedule, it's much better than Khabib Nurmagomedov's overall. But Khabib, because he was able to get that sustained dominance and because he was able to get 3 title defenses, I believe Khabib is just barely above Charles Oliveira. But if Charles beats Islam Makhachev, Charles will easily surpass Khabib Nurmagomedov. And I believe Khabib did himself kind of a disservice. I mean, I understand he retired for personal reasons, but if he continued to fight, I think he beats Charles Oliveira. I think he beats a lot of these guys, I think he beats Michael Chandler. So I believe Khabib, had he stayed around for another year, 2 years, and actually fought more than once a year, he would have sustained himself as the GOAT, and it would have been almost insurmountable for anybody to pass him. But the thing is, you can't be the GOAT forever when you retired so early in your career. I understand he was at a high point, and that's why a lot of people want to put him at the top, but you can't be the employee of the month every month when you don't show up for work, okay? And Khabib will always go down in history as one of the lightweight GOATs, but I think Charles Oliveira can easily surpass him very soon. And as far as Islam Makhachev, because Islam Makhachev, good friend and training partner of Khabib Nurmagomedov, Islam Makhachev is 13-1 in the UFC, the current UFC lightweight champion. He's on a 12-fight winning streak. He has 8 finishes and 1 title defense, and he's also been very dominant. And you look at Islam Makhachev's resume, he beat Charles Oliveira to win the belt, and then he defended against Alexander Volkanovski, which I know a lot of people kind of discredited Makhachev because the fight was close. I thought this was one of the best championship performances I have ever seen from anyone. For Islam Makhachev to defeat Alexander Volkanovski was an incredible performance. And also, to beat Charles Oliveira, I mean, what a feather in his cap that is. To beat Charles Oliveira in the way he did, incredible. So now he's won the title, he's defended the belt once, and it looks like he's going to fight Charles Oliveira again. If he defeats Charles Oliveira again, I think there's a discussion to be had, an argument to be made that he will surpass Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, I believe the way he would truly surpass Khabib is if he beats Charles Oliveira again, and which I favor him to do, and then maybe Volkanovski comes back up again as the featherweight champion. He defeats Alexander Volkanovski again. It is beyond debate. Islam Makhachev will be the GOAT of the lightweight division. He will have surpassed Khabib Nurmagomedov. And I know people crap on Islam's resume. Islam's resume isn't that bad. Absolutely dominated Dan Hooker. I know it was on short notice, okay? Beat Thiago Moises. Not the greatest of wins, but Thiago Moises was criminally underrated in my opinion. Dominated Drew Dober. Beat Arman Tsarukyan, and I know that was on his UFC debut and on short notice. So I understand there's a lot of context you can add to these wins as well. But my argument is, if Islam Makhachev already defeated Charles Oliveira, he defended against Alexander Volkanovski, beat him, and then if he defeats Charles Oliveira again for his second title defense, and then he defends his title one more time, whether it be against Alexander Volkanovski or someone else, I think Islam Makhachev surpassed them both. In my opinion, I think that resume would speak for itself. Just those last 4 or 5 fights would speak for themselves. But ultimately, it's super subjective. Your GOAT may not be the same as other people's GOATs. Some people might say Frankie Edgar. Some people might say Benson Henderson. I just think it is ridiculous. People discrediting Charles Oliveira for having losses when he was young and he was still getting better. You can get better in this sport. You can get better at anything. You can go on to become the greatest of all time in something. You can go on to become the best. Just because you aren't at one point in time doesn't mean you can't eventually go on to become that. So I just wanted to make this video discussing it. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.